You might hear the term king tides thrown around over the next couple days, and that's not a scientific term, but it does explain this incredible astronomical phenomenon that will be felt from Long Beach, Washington to Long Beach, California, and really all up and down the Pacific coast, as well as some locations on the East Coast. So what exactly is going on here? Why is this important? And what are you going to see locally? Well, we'll talk about it, but it all starts with Lady Luna up there. I've got a smaller version that I'm going to use to help explain this a little bit. So when you think about tides on Earth, you probably think about the moon, like we talked about, right? And that is the largest driving force for our tides, but it's not the only one. You also have to think about the big guy, the sun, which is about 400 times larger than the moon. Certainly not to scale here, but we also have a big difference in distance. You've got the moon about 400 times closer to Earth than the sun is, somewhere way out of frame. And so when we talk about gravity and that gravitational attraction, the distance matters more than that mass. And so that's why the moon is that main driving force. But these two can work together or against each other at different times in the orbital cycles. So let's isolate that Earth-Moon relationship for just a moment and talk about what that does, and then you can consider the sun doing the same thing before we reincorporate it. So when you have your high tides, that's going to be when you're facing towards or directly away from the moon. Your low tides are going to be at the other sides, right? So you've got this kind of four section, you get your lows here and here, you've got your high tides here and over here. Now, that story just moves around the Earth. Those tides rotate with the moon, and so that's how we get through most places getting two high tides and two low tides every single day. But then we add in the sun, and the alignments of these three all matter a whole lot. Think about it like this. If we place the sun here and we place the moon here, think about what we're seeing. We've got the moon pulling in this direction, right? You've got tides going this way, and then if we have the sun here, it's pulling in this direction. So we have these opposite poles, and so your low tides from the moon are going to line up with the higher solar tides, and everything cancels out a little bit. And this is called a neap tide, right? You have your highest low tides and your lowest high tides because everything's just kind of canceled out. But then consider if we're all in alignment, a straight line straight across. What does that mean? Well, we're talking about seeing your high tides from the sun pulled in this direction, and your high tides from the moon also pulled that way, and then your high tides from the moon pulled in this direction, and your high tides from the sun also going in the same direction. So when we're in alignment like this, aka when your lunar phase is either a full moon or a new moon, and you've got the moon between the Earth and sun, that's when you have your spring tides, the highest high tides and the lowest low tides, biggest tidal ranges. And this right here is the baseline for king tides, but there's another level that we need to have. So now is where we step away from these perfect, pretty little models and the ideal, the perfect circles, all of that, to the real, those messy orbits, because orbits in the solar system just aren't clean. They're going to be elliptical. There's going to be long points and short points, and so everybody is closer to each other at different points in their orbital cycles. So let's talk about each of those, right? The Earth is orbiting the sun. It is closest to the sun on January 4th every year. That's that closest point for us. So that's called perihelion, closest to helion, the sun. So that's our perihelion. That's a date to keep in mind. Now, the moon rotates around the Earth much faster, right? We've got about a 29-day lunar cycle. So somewhere in that cycle, you have your closest point. But that's called a perigee. So we need our perigee and perihelion to line up. So what that means is that whichever of those two phases we talked about with the spring tides, either the full moon or the new moon, that happens closest to January 4th in those surrounding months, so December, January, sometimes November, sometimes February, whichever happens closest to perihelion, that's when you're going to see those king tides. So we have all of those forces magnified and they're all facing in the same direction. That's the key for those king tides. Now, just how high are these king-size tides? Well, the California King Tide Project estimates about 1 to 2 feet above your average high tide in most locations, which doesn't sound like a lot, but makes a big difference for some of those low-lying piers and boardwalks, things like that. So you got to be ready, and if you run into a flooded road, just don't even think about it. If we have 2 high tides a day in most locations, which one are we watching for? Well, with this king tide event on December 4th, 5th, and in some cases the 6th, you're looking at that morning high tide. And that ranges from about 7 a.m. to noon, depending on exactly where you're at. I checked locations all throughout California. And in Southern California, it's a little earlier. As you get up towards the Humboldt and Del Norte coast, things are a little bit closer to 10 to noon, depending on the day. But you can check your location no matter where you're at. The NOAA Tides and Currents page, check out a measurement station, a buoy in your area for that astronomical tide forecast, right? Specifically what's driven by our friends, the sun and the moon. But there's also that weather element that you got to consider. I'm always thinking of it as a meteorologist. You got to think about the swell, the wind, the waves over the ocean that may increase the coastal flooding that we see out of these king tides, because that's not accounted for by the sun and the moon, that relationship. But you might see some higher swell, and so you might see those tides come in maybe a half a foot or a foot higher than is estimated on that NOAA Tides and Currents page. And yes, you might have guessed, this is indeed just a lake. I don't live close enough to the ocean to show you the real crashing waves, but if you do, show me in the comments. Would love to see those king tide impacts. Thanks for joining me today. I'll have another video breaking down weather phenomena or astronomical phenomena coming up in the next couple days.